Good evening. Thanks for coming. It's been a long day, but you have a great treat in front of you. So, I'm Ann Humphreys. I was chair of the Robert and Vineta Colby Book Prize, Scholarly Book Prize this year. And so it's my pleasure to be able to introduce the winner of that prize, who will be speaking as you'll see. But I wanted to begin with just a couple of words, both about the prize and about Robert and Vineta Colby. They were, again, both of them, major scholars in Victorian studies. They did really groundbreaking work on periodical culture and were loyal attendees and contributors to the workings of RSVP in its early days and really until 10 years ago in some sense. When Robert died, Vineta gave us money to fund a prize in his memory, and at that point it was the Robert Colby Scholarly Book Prize. And then Vineta died a few years later, and the organization decided to make it an award in both of their names. The book prize is for books in the previous year, so this prize is for books published in 2015. We have a committee of 5 members of RSVP. We had about 10 books nominated. With much discussion, we narrowed it down to a short list of 5, and then a late entry came in and it became a short list of 6. The committee had really hard choices among these books, but in the end, we all agreed, it was actually unanimous, that the winner would be Mary L. Shannon for her book, Dickens, Reynolds, and Mayhew on Wellington Street. Published by Ashgate. I mean, it was Ashgate at that point, right, in 2015. But we also wanted to recognize another of the books that came in hardly as a second, but certainly deserving recognition with an honorable mention. And that is the book by Marianne van Remortel called Women, Work, and the Victorian Periodical Press, Living by the Press. And I just wanted to read to you the statements that were made by the committee, the sort of general statement we had about the 2 books. Mary L. Shannon's Dickens, Reynolds, and Mayhew on Wellington Street is an innovative expansion of the current interest in tracing networks into a consideration of the more concrete juxtaposition of bodies and buildings in space and other. Structured creatively around a day in the life of a street, the book entices us into seeing what would have been obvious to the Victorian eye and ear, but which our standard narratives have occluded. Shannon connects some of the more ephemeral products of the press and the situation of their production with canonical works such as Bleak House, produced in the same milieu. It is a book that models new ways to do our business. And about Marianne's book, Marianne van Remortel's Women, Work, and the Victorian Periodical is an elegantly written and carefully researched picture of the lives of women press workers who were part of the growth of the Victorian periodicals in the mid and late century. With great insight and a sophisticated ability to use new tools to track lives, she persuades us of the interest and value of knowing the biographical details, not only of the well-known women who contributed, such as Christina Rossetti, but also the lesser-known creators, such as Mrs. Warren, Eliza Warren Francis, of the Ladies' Treasury. The book is a delight to read. So just a few sentences about Mary herself. She is she did her graduate work at King's College London and is currently a lecturer of English literature at Roehampton. The title, she has a really interesting new project, which maybe we can talk about it over dinner, but this is about the 2015 project that turned into the book. The title of her talk is Mornings on Wellington Street, the print culture of a London street. Will you welcome Mary Shannon?
Thank you, Anne, for that introduction, and thank you all for coming to this lecture at the end of a really busy conference day. My thanks to the Colby Prize Committee and to RSVP and to the conference organisers for inviting me to speak here today, and particular thanks to Jennifer Fegley for her kindness and amazing efficiency in all matters to do with this event and the whole conference. I should say before I start, there is a handout in your conference pack. It's a white sheet with a map of Wellington Street on it that you might find interesting, useful to refer to or just look at points during the talk. If you don't have one in your pack, Maria at the front or Jennifer at the back has a copy, so stick your hand up if you need a copy of the handout and they'll get one to you. I think there's a couple of hands at the back there, Jennifer, on your right. Okay. So I was at the conference for the British Association for Victorian Studies in Cardiff last week, and I was struck by something one of the plenary speakers said about what they felt was the autobiographical nature of much research. That our own stories seem sometimes to influence our work. And I think I first became interested in the cultural geography of London because I was born and brought up there. London may be a city of strangers, that's the cliche, isn't it? But it's also a collection of villagers, another cliche that is, I think, true. And on a surprisingly regular basis, I find myself bumping into friends on busy tube station platforms, on bridges, at the theatre, just round the corner, in a way that seems really counterintuitive in such a large city. When you share similar interests and lifestyles, London can begin to feel like a much smaller place. When you work in the same parts of London, it can start to feel very localised. But it is, of course, an international city with links far across the globe. My interest in Wellington Street began with my PhD thesis at King's College London, with me wondering about Victorian London and whether Charles Dickens and his associates experienced a similar kind of interconnected city. With his friends, colleagues, rivals at work in journalism, literature, and the theatre, Dickens, of course, operated in a shared environment of print culture, of visual culture. But could I find any concrete evidence of the importance of networks and face-to-face connections in Dickens's work as a journalist and editor? And what might this tell us about the importance of physical proximity in the city for the 19th century periodical press and publishing industry across the developing British Empire? Often in research, you need a bit of luck, and my serendipitous moment came when I compared the office address at the back of Dickens's magazine Household Words with the office address on the back of Reynolds' newspaper. Both of these periodicals, of course, were started in 1850. Reynolds' newspaper was established and edited by one of Dickens's biggest rivals, G.W.M. Reynolds, who was developing into something of Dickens's arch nemesis. Reynolds, as I'm sure you know, made his name initially through publishing imitations of Dickens's popular fiction. And by 1850, Reynolds and Dickens were conducting a war of words in their respective publications. Dickens attacked Reynolds in Household Words, and Reynolds insulted Dickens in Reynolds' newspaper. By this point, Dickens was objecting to Reynolds' radical politics as much as his literary rip-offs. However, my comparison of their office addresses showed that Reynolds' denunciations of Dickens and of household words were published from the same street as the very periodical which he attacked. Household Words was at number 16, Reynolds' newspaper was at number 7. So Reynolds' office was just across the road from Dickens. The street they both worked on was Wellington Street, home then as now to the Lyceum Theatre, where the Lion King is on at the moment, if you remember. So, which today, it finishes at the Strand, just above Waterloo Bridge, and it begins at Bow Street, below Covent Garden Opera House. I discovered that Henry Mayhew was also there at the same time, publishing the serial edition of London Labour and the London Poor, a few doors away from Dickens. When they visited their offices, they could easily have passed each other in the street. And so I spent quite a bit of time walking up and down Wellington Street, looking at the buildings, picturing to myself the three men walking around the same street, seeing the same sights, passing by the same street sellers, being aware of each other's offices. Dickens, Reynolds, and Mayhew were surrounded on Wellington Street by many other well-known writers and editors: George Augustus Sala, Douglas Jerrold, John Forster, G.H. Lewis, Punch, The Examiner, The Literary Gazette, The Morning Post, The Spectator, The Argus, The Leader, and more. In all, there were more than 20 newspapers, miscellanies, periodicals, which had their offices on the three sections of Wellington Street in the 1840s and 50s, and 13 publishers or booksellers. These writers and editors wrote for multiple periodicals, collaborated again and again in different combinations, and helped each other through shared contacts and shared publishing ventures. London's publishing world in the Strand area in particular, and in Strand area in general, and Wellington Street in particular, was made up of interconnected social and business networks. Print culture, theatrical culture, bohemian roistering, and reformist politics were all mixed up together, in a kind of interesting melting pot, which drove the conditions of production. Wellington Street had a significance that went beyond its place in London print culture. It played a part in the print culture of the Empire, too, as journalists in colonial Melbourne looked to Wellington Street in particular as a kind of cultural touchstone. So the study of this street enables us to consider writers, editors, publishers, illustrators, dramatists, all together, to think about what Laurel Brake has called the structures of 19th century journalism. So today I'm going to suggest that the occupants of Wellington Street would have had a sense of themselves as part of a close-knit community dedicated to the production of print, a conception heightened by their proximity within urban space. I want to propose that close geographical proximity meant that famous names of mid-Victorian print culture were more than just aware of each other in print, in their letters, at social occasions. They would have seen each other in the street, or seen each other's premises when they went to their own, and been aware that friends and rivals and colleagues were working at addresses that were within a few hundred yards of their own editorial address. Benedict Anderson argues convincingly that from the 18th century onwards, the novel and the newspaper provided the technical means for presenting the nation as an imagined community, creating, as he puts it, that remarkable confidence of community in anonymity, which is the hallmark of modern nations. However, those involved in the actual production of this very print culture in mid-Victorian London operated themselves within a face-to-face community very much lacking in anonymity, in ways which were problematic as well as enabling. The experience of Dickens and his contemporaries on Wellington Street was one of working in a remarkably interconnected community made up of interlocking networks. I'm not trying to propose that Wellington Street created all these networks. Many friendships and collaborations existed or occurred before their members had any connections with Wellington Street. But what I do think Wellington Street shows us is that members of these networks, which collaborated and competed closely in print, shared the same experiences of the print economy in the same short street. So I'm hoping to do three things in the time remaining: to take you on a tour of Wellington Street, to show you who Dickens's neighbours were, both friends and rivals, and the handout shows a map of some of the most interesting offices, or some of the locations that I've picked out that were most interesting for me. I want to show you what these journalists and editors might have seen and heard as they arrived at their offices in the morning. I'm going to try and paint a picture so you can see and hear and smell and imagine what it might have been like on the street. And I'm going to end by suggesting that what attention to physical proximity can do for our understanding not only of the conditions of periodical production, but also for the words on the page. I'm going to look briefly at household words, and in particular the preliminary word with which the first number opened in 1850, before finishing with Melbourne Punch. In the process, I hope to show you that thinking about buildings and offices and proximity can offer interesting insights into periodical studies. So to make my case, I'm going to ask you to come with me on a trip to the metropolis. Instead of it being early evening in early autumn 2016, I want you to imagine that it is morning in autumn 1851, and we are in Trafalgar Square looking down the Strand. In 1851, the Strand was a shopping street as renowned as Oxford Street, well known for the roar and din and bustle and agitation of wheels and horses and men, as one Wellington Street editor described it. The Strand, as I'm sure you know, sits between Holborn and Covent Garden to the north, Pall Mall, Whitehall and St James's to the west, Fleet Street and the City to the east, and the River Thames to the south, with Somerset House and King's College London as major landmarks. The editors and writers of the Strand were therefore surrounded by theatres, big newspaper offices, and the Inns of Court. They would have encountered playbills, law stationers, printers, university students, lawyers, and printers. This was the heart of journalistic London. St Paul's Churchyard and Paternoster Row remained the key bookselling district, and Holywell Street was the place to go for cheap pornography, but printers and publishers clustered around the Strand well into the 19th century. As Andrew King puts it, this area was, and I quote, a cultural field which is both geographically material and metaphysical. Or in other words, printed matter was everywhere. Wellington Street, however, was much shorter, and so had a more compact community than the Strand. It takes about 20 minutes to walk the length of the Strand, but barely 5 minutes to walk the length of Wellington Street. In 1851, Wellington Street was made up of 3 sections, as you can see from your handout. There's Upper Wellington Street North, which ran down to the Strand, and finally on the south side of the Strand, the original Wellington Street, which was also called Wellington Street South. Now, this was not a salubrious area. The top end of Wellington Street was in one of the city's ancient red light districts, notorious for brothels and bathhouses, and locals complained repeatedly to the parish vestry about Mr. and Mrs. Stanley's brothel at 14 Upper Wellington Street, described gleefully in 1849 as one of the filthiest kind to be found in London. And the Stanley's Coffee House is still listed in the 1853 Post Office directory. So when Dickens arrives, this is not a fancy area that we're talking about, although it has facilities of a potentially interesting kind. Sanitary conditions were poor, and several streets still had open cesspools instead of sewers. In 1848, Douglas Gerald, the landlord, requested permission at the expense of the said Douglas Gerald to flap the drain of number 17 Wellington Street Strand, presumably because the smell from the drain was offending Gerald's nose. Charles Bielfeld's papier-mâché factory, which is next door to Dickens's office, filled the street with noise and smoke and caused locals to complain about the hordes of vagabond boys that were employed there. As the editors of Wellington Street laboured in their offices, machine labour and manual labour was going on in the very same street, so no wonder Dickens described himself as putting on steam when his work was going well. The 18th century brick terraces still survive on parts of Wellington Street, and their windows are very close together, and even the buildings on opposite sides of the street are very close, so occupants would have been very aware of their neighbours. So from 1850 onwards, Wellington Street was the frequent destination of Dickens's morning commute. According to one colleague, Dickens would arrive at his office at about 8 o'clock and begin dictating, combing his hair nervously as he strode about the room. Famous for his perambulations around the city, Dickens walked the last stretch of his journey to the office, as Percy Fitzgerald recalled. Dickens had a favourite private walk from the southeastern station to the office, always taking Chandos Street, perhaps a reminder of the childish blacking days, and through Maiden Lane into Wellington Street. Local tradesmen noted regularly his lithe figure briskly flitting past as the clock struck, his little bag in his hand. Well, if Dickens had occasion to walk down Wellington Street to his office, other editors must have done too. Furthermore, just as the local tradesmen noticed Dickens, Dickens and his fellow editors must have noticed the bookshops, workshops, and other premises which they passed at the start of their day. Many of them headed each morning to small offices of the kind pictured in Sala's Twice Round the Clock in 1859. And some of the more struggling writers and editors lived in the offices which they rented, so they didn't need to travel very far at all in the morning. Now, what interests me was that many of Dickens's neighbours were part of a network of friends, colleagues, and collaborators. Household Words, as I said, was at 16 Wellington Street North. Next door but one, at 14 Wellington Street North, was the office of the Athenaeum. Now, this highly respected literary journal was published by John Francis, who'd helped to prop up the Daily News when Dickens left his short-lived editorial role there. Until 1849, number 14 had also contained the offices of the Railway Chronicle, which was edited by John Scott Russell, who'd been railway editor for Dickens at the Daily News. A 2-minute stroll away, at number 5 Wellington Street South, was the office of the Examiner, edited by Dickens's close friend and literary advisor, John Forster. On Upper Wellington Street, Mayhew had just opened the office of London Labour and the London Poor. Mayhew's friend Henry Sutherland Edwards remarked that at the Morning Chronicle on the Strand, where the series originated, Mayhew, and I quote, had an army of assistant writers, stenographers, and hansom cabmen constantly at his call. So one wonders if Mayhew's mornings at his own office were quite so bustling. Mayhew's new office was next door to the building from which his father-in-law, Douglas Jerrold, had run Douglas Jerrold's weekly newspaper 2 years previously, and where one of the most famous contributors to Household Words, George Augustus Sala, lived. Sala's morning walk at the turn of the decade was away from Wellington Street rather than towards it, as he was renting a room on the ground floor of number 17, and he was training by day to be an engraver with a firm at Beaufort Buildings in the Strand. In 1843, before Dickens arrived, the officers of Punch magazine spent their last few months based at 13 Wellington Street South, before the serial was sold to Bradbury and Evans and moved to Fleet Street. So these men met at the Lyceum Theatre, in the coffee rooms, they set up informal clubs, in the local taverns, they socialized, they worked together, some were godparents to each other's children. Physical proximity, however, was not all fun and games. Daily life for the editors and journalists on Wellington Street involved rivalry just as much as it did friendly collaboration, like the rivalry between Dickens and Reynolds that I've already mentioned. As I said, Reynolds published Reynolds Miscellany and Reynolds Newspaper from number 7 Wellington Street North. Number 7 had living accommodation as well as a publishing office. So for the Reynolds, there was no morning commute. They simply had to walk downstairs until they moved out to North London a couple of years later. In March 1850, in the first number of Household Words, Dickens attacked Reynolds as someone who panders to the basest passions of the lowest natures, whose existence is a national reproach. In June, Reynolds returned the favour by publishing a scornful denunciation of Household Words, which called it as much use for alleviating the suffering of the poor as lip sympathy to a starving man. And this continues in print, with them insulting each other off and on in their publications. George was not the only member of the Reynolds household with a reason to feel antipathy towards Dickens's circle. 7 Wellington Street North was also the publishing address for George Reynolds' wife, Susanna Frances Reynolds. Susanna Reynolds was significant because she was a female writer and editor in the midst of this very homosocial world that I'm describing. In November 1847, the Daily News, first edited, of course, by Dickens, published a negative review of Susanna Reynolds' serial novel, Gretna Green. The review was probably written by the son of the editor of the Athenaeum at number 14, a family friend of Dickens. In the review, Susanna's book was discussed as part of a group of texts said to promote sex and violence. This is an overstatement of the excitement of the novel, but also a terrible threat to the moral standing and therefore the livelihood of Susanna and her husband. So the Reynoldses, they swung into action. They engaged their solicitors, Roche, Plowman and Roche, at number 2, Upper Wellington Street, and they demanded an apology in print in a letter to the new editor, Forster. A retraction followed swiftly in the next week in the Daily News, but Reynolds continued to make public attacks. An article in Reynolds' Miscellany about the affair declares of the Daily News, "Do you call this thing a newspaper?" While in Reynolds' The Mysteries of London, one character tells another that. The name of Charles Dickens is rather damnatory than useful to newspaper speculation. Everyone must admit that Boz is a great novelist, but he is totally incapable of writing for a newspaper. The proprietors of the News made a tremendous splash with his name, but they only created a quagmire for themselves to flounder in. So this has rumbled on for quite a while, and Dickens had to have been aware of these attacks given his close relationship with Forster. So the point I'm making is that the community of Wellington Street was not a stable or an entirely friendly one, but it was one dominated by the production and distribution and use of printed material. Physical proximity would have heightened one's awareness of one's own position within this print-producing community. For example, from the offices of Reynolds' Miscellany, it would have been easy to see across to the windows of the Household Words office. And I spent a happy afternoon in the offices of a very trendy advertising company, staring out of the window, trying to work out if the angles were right. This building was on the site of Reynolds' original office. Could he have seen across to Dickens? And I decided that yes, he definitely could. But the advertising company were very bemused by my presence, as I'm sure you can imagine. So Reynolds, when he was in the office, he would have been faced with the concrete physical existence of a periodical edited by Dickens, a man who is seeking to emulate but also to outdo. The distinctive bow windows of number 16 are made much of in Percy Fitzgerald's account of the office and would have been visible, I'm pretty convinced, albeit at an angle, from inside number 7. According to Fitzgerald, as you looked from the other side of the street, you could see well through the windows that the drawing room floor, where the master sat, was handsomely furnished. So from such big windows, an occupant would also have been keenly aware of the street outside. Household Words, you can see on the map, was directly opposite the Lyceum Theatre, where adaptations of Dickens's fiction played during the 1840s. In the Morning Post's report of a fire which threatened the Lyceum in 1854, the closeness of the buildings is very much a matter of comment when fires can spread so quickly and so easily. So we hear about the cool and uninterrupted manner in which the printers of the Morning Post newspaper, almost next to joining, pursued their ordinary avocation. At the same time, Mr. Charles Dickens was doing good service at his office of Household Words by encouraging the firemen in their labours. You just imagine how annoying he must have been to the firemen at this point. But Dickens is so close when at his window that the reporter from the Morning Post can see and hear him. As well as the visibility of the buildings, each morning the sense of operating in a community united by the production of print as much as by proximity, would have been enforced by the presence and visibility of print on the street. Wellington Street may not have been as renowned as Paternoster Row, or less respectably Holywell Street in terms of bookselling, but in 1850, Wellington Street was home to several booksellers with different specialisms. Next to Household Words was the theatrical bookshop of T.H. Lacey, who sold playtexts of Dickens' adaptations. Alexander Black, seller of luxury foreign books, had premises at 8 Wellington Street North, and Martin Taylor sold books from 1 Wellington Street South. Sotheby's and Lee, the book auctioneers, now just Sotheby's, had premises at 3 Wellington Street South during this time before they moved to their New Bond Street address. Other businesses which serviced the print economy were hugely active on Wellington Street. So if you look at the post office directories between 1843 and 53, you can find a type founders, a music copyist, a stationer's, a lithographer, a printer, and a black lead pencil maker. Printed material, therefore, was highly visible for both rival editors and their readers. Seeing the Lyceum each morning might have reminded Dickens that the networks of Wellington Street linked stage and page in more ways than just through T.H. Lacey's theatrical bookshop. In the 40s and 50s, several of the writers and editors with connections to Wellington Street wrote for audiences at the Lyceum almost as much as they wrote for the readers of their periodicals, their fiction, or their newspapers. Dickens and Mayhew's networks were particularly prolific Lyceum dramatists. Gerald, Gilbert Beckett, Shirley Brooks, G.H. Lewis, Angus B. Reach, and Albert Smith all wrote for the Lyceum stage, and all edited or wrote for publications based on Wellington Street. Albert Smith produced the prologue for a Lyceum adaptation of Martin Chuzzlewit, which was actually authorized by Dickens, one of the ones he was happy about. And then this was sold as a script by Lacey. Smith's brother, of course, later managed Dickens's reading tours. And Smith, in fact, married a daughter of the Lyceum managers, Mr. and Mrs. Keeley, and their other son-in-law was Montague Williams, who not only contributed to Household Words, but wrote plays and farces as well. So if our editors, who knew that ex-colleagues and friends and rivals worked only a few doors away from them, if they had a sense of print production as a face-to-face community, as a world where you could bump into each other on a regular basis on the street, where you'd see your rivals' offices as you walked around the street, then this, I think, has implications for the composition of Dickens's editorial address to his imagined readers in Household Words. The preliminary word with which the first issue of Household Words opened has a clear awareness of those publications which operate around it. Dickens writes, "Some tillers of the field into which we now come have been before us, and some are here whose high usefulness we readily acknowledge, and whose company it is an honor to join. But there are others here, bastards of the mountain, draggled fringe on the red cap, panders to the basest passions of the lowest natures, whose existence is a national reproach. And these we should consider it our highest service to displace." So publications and their editors, which came before, are divided here into two categories. Those considered of high usefulness, whose company it's an honor to join, and those whose existence is a national reproach. Dickens' opinions on fellow inhabitants of Wellington Street fit these two categories. We've already seen what Dickens thought of Reynolds across the street at number 7, but he felt very differently, of course, about some of his other neighbors. The Literary Gazette, the Examiner, the Athenaeum were all based on Wellington Street and were respected publications which he certainly did not see as a national reproach. For Dickens, the only national reproach on this block is Reynolds. The preliminary word uses the word field figuratively. Those publications here, which Household Words hopes to join, are those already printed and published. Here is the imagined space of print culture. But it is also here, the geographical space of Wellington Street, where publications which Dickens admired and publications which he disliked sat side by side. Dickens addresses the reader as a friend, as if part of his immediate social network. Print in the preliminary word envisages an imagined network of shared experience for both readers and writer, precisely because, from his Wellington Street office, Dickens could see a community with shared experience of print culture right outside his window. I've argued for the importance of considering physical proximity when thinking about the conditions of periodical production. We've been talking a lot about growth and expansion today, so I want to finish by suggesting that we can use the close study of one street to move outwards beyond the metropolis to investigate how London's print culture intersected with that of the empire. Wellington Street's writers and editors generated ideas and modes of thought and operation which spread out and gave life to print networks on the other side of the globe. I'm going to use the example of colonial Melbourne, a city founded in 1835, to which writers, periodicals, and newspapers from Wellington Street found their way. And I'm going to briefly focus on Wellington Street emigrants, R.H. Horne and Melbourne Punch. Now, given the importance that I've been placing on the closely packed, close proximity of Wellington Street, the introduction of Melbourne into this picture may seem something of a stretch. But the connections between Wellington Street in London and Collins Street in Melbourne show us that because the networks of Wellington Street were reinforced by strong ties of physical proximity, they had the strength to become transnational and to be replicated abroad. In the time remaining, I can only lightly sketch some of the ways in which the transplanting of brands like Punch and of celebrities like Horne played a significant role in Melbourne's dramatic transformation over only 2 decades from a small settlement to a lively literary hub. As I've mentioned, Punch was on Wellington Street until 1843, and Punchites Gerald and Mayhew remained on Wellington Street into the 40s and 50s. R.H. Horne, Robert Hengist Horne, Charles Dickens's friend and colleague, worked at the Household Words office in Wellington Street and socialised with staff members of London's Punch, who also all worked nearby, and he exemplified the interconnected networks which operated in and around the street. So he was a member of Dickens's amateur dramatic troupe. He performed before the Queen with John Forster, Mark Lemon, G.H. Lewis. Dickens said he was a really bad actor. Horne knew Forster in his own right in the 1830s and first met William Howitt, fellow Household Words contributor and later fellow emigrant, through his mother. Horne collaborated with Gerald and Angus B. Reach on their Whittington Club, and he contributed to Douglas Gerald's Shilling magazine. In 1852, Horne left Wellington Street and sailed for the Melbourne goldfields. 3 years later, having failed to make his fortune with gold, he became a contributor to Melbourne Punch, which was started in 1855 in Collins Street in Melbourne and was presented very self-consciously as a child of London Punch. When Horne arrived in Melbourne, he carried with him immense cultural capital, and he played a key part in linking colonial Melbourne and the networks of Wellington Street. So Horne and Punch reveal the structural connections between the print culture of Wellington Street, London, and Collins Street, Melbourne. In 1855, the following notice was published in the Argus, one of Melbourne's many periodicals set up on Collins Street. Melbourne Punch, Jr. Esquire, begs to announce that having emigrated to the city which bears his name, he is determined to issue a weekly periodical of a highly interesting and instructive character. The first number will appear on or before Thursday, the 2nd of August. So this notice mimicked the reports published in Melbourne's newspapers, which marked the arrival of noteworthy emigrants. The first number of Melbourne Punch carried a cartoon of Mr. Punch Jr.'s triumphant arrival in Melbourne, as its founding editors worked to create a body for their personified periodical. Here in this page cartoon, Melbourne Punch trades on itself as a transplanting and also a reinvention of London print culture. Above the cartoon of Punch's arrival in Melbourne is the depiction of his departure. We see Melbourne Punch as a member of the Punch family, son of the celebrated Mr. Punch of London. The reader is asked to infer from the cartoon that Punch Jr. will go on to great things as in the colony, even as they're asked to enjoy its mockery of the gold rush emigrants. London print culture is used here to bolster Melbourne's fledgling periodicals. The well-known features of Mr. Punch, which are described here, are both the resemblance of the cartoon son to his cartoon father and the resemblance of the layout and the typeface of Melbourne Punch to its London parent. I'm sure you can see the similarities between the way Melbourne Punch is laid out and the original London Punch. The body of the emigrant and the materiality of the printed page are linked. The vigorous youth, I quote, of the new venture is used both to link Melbourne Punch to and differentiate it from the London version. There was also a notice in the Sydney Empire which announced the arrival of Horne and his travel companion William Howitt, which also played up on their old world connections, like this spoof report of the arrival of Melbourne Punch. It portrayed the two men as carriers of London print culture. A ship Kent, which arrived in Melbourne 2 or 3 weeks ago, brought to that colony two gentlemen who've earned for themselves a distinguished rank in the world of literature. As it may be safely calculated that these gentlemen will shortly visit our metropolis, we have extracted from a work recently published in London the following brief notices of their literary antecedents, and it goes on. And this sense here in the notice of Horne's and Howitt's participation in a specific world was bolstered, I think, by Horne's participation in Wellington Street's print networks in the 40s and 50s. Horne provided a physical link to the culture of home. A conversation with Horne was one remove away from a conversation with Dickens or with Gerald. At the Melbourne Garrick Club and Dwight's bookshop, Horne held court in imitation of Dickens' clique and inspired the next generation of Melbourne writers and journalists, both newly arrived emigrants and eventually Melbourne-born. And these included Marcus Clarke and George Gordon McRae. As on Wellington Street, business and socialising went hand in hand, and the Collins Street journalists, several of whom had Wellington Street connections themselves, were similarly dependent for their survival upon ties of proximity, collaboration, rivalry, and marriage. At the same time, London and Melbourne were frequently aligned in language and rhetoric, and the complex relations which they drew between colonial and metropolitan print culture, the kind of push-pull of wanting to emulate but also wanting to outdo, demand, I think, a more nuanced and careful scrutiny than is perhaps allowed by Benedict Anderson's picture of the imagined community. Despite the fact of Horne and his network's physical separation from London, they created a cultural construction of physical proximity and face-to-face sociability to try and connect readers and writers across the empire in an imagined network of print. There's more work, I think, to be done about how 19th century print networks function on the ground and on the ways in which these networks, established in the imperial metropolis, enabled colonial print cultures to spring rapidly to life. As Horne declared in the poem which first made his name, "'Tis always morning somewhere in the world." I've argued that print networks are reinforced by physical proximity within urban space and played an important role in how these mid-century writers and editors imagined their relations to each other and to their readers. In an era where technological advances allow us greater virtual communication than ever before, we should not blind ourselves, I think, to the importance of face-to-face networks in the human imagination. Thank you. With me was when Dickens and Reynolds and Mayhew coexist, and really in terms of density of periodicals, it's a period of quite a tight period between 1840, the beginning of the 1840s up till the end of the 1850s. Dickens is still on Wellington Street for the rest of his career. He moves. Once he moves from, closes Household Words and opens all the year round, he moves up the street, but he stays there. But this particular period in the 40s and the 50s is just jam-packed with interesting collaboration and interesting rivalries. And in terms of a relationship to Fleet Street, I think what's significant about Wellington Street is its size, actually. That it's so much narrower than Fleet Street and the Strand. It's so much shorter. You cannot get away from the presence of the buildings. You can see the portico of the Lyceum Theatre the whole way up it. You'd be so aware of the interconnection of theatrical culture and print culture in a way that the busier streets, the Strand and Fleet Street, where you have other kinds of businesses as well in high density, where they are shopping streets as much as publishing arenas. That real sense of being in a close-knit world, I think, would not have been there to the same extent. Oh, yeah, Paul.
Thank you very much. That's fascinating. I was wondering about literary production, the phrase, about if you follow that to the material printing production, and how much you think that aspect matters in the sort of networks or the kind of concept of locality. If you found examples of, where these things go, and it doesn't matter if they're printed this place or that place, and where they're housed and sold. I'm just interested in how far you would extrapolate this notion of the kind of local networking.
I would have liked to have thought more about printers actually, but again, it's all very local. So Reynolds' printer is right around the corner. In fact, at first they are printing in the office. The printers' offices tend to be on the sort of little back streets, the little courts just off the main drag. But you're sort of 2 steps away from going around to a printer. They're all right there, and you can see why. I mean, if you think about agglomeration theory, which is a big theory in urban studies, the idea that as technical communication becomes more sophisticated, actually cities get smaller. People cluster together if they're working in the same kinds of field, and communities coalesce in the same, where they're producing the same kind of stuff. So the printers were right by these offices. The brothels were just across the street. The tavern was right there. Like, everything you needed to be a Victorian editor, to do your work and to go to the theatre afterwards and then carry on through the night. It was all right there. So certainly this is a world of kind of close sociability just as much as close production. But yeah, I would have liked to have thought more about printers. Yeah.
This is a question about streets and Victorian periodicals. I've noticed, I don't know, I imagine we've all noticed that a lot of periodicals bear the names of streets. And I was wondering what you think about that.
That's a good question. I mean, certainly the Strand magazine loves the obvious examples. And I wonder, one of the things that I was really looking for and hoping to find and didn't find was any kind of discussion of Wellington Street itself and the life in this way, in letters or in diaries. You can extrapolate, you can speculate from the evidence, but Dickens never sat down and wrote and said, God, it's great, everybody's right here. So I suppose my answer to your question would be that I like to think that those titles are some kind of recognition of the fact that this is a close geographical area producing so many of the publications, which then spread out around very vast geographical areas, both being exported but also being imitated. I like to think that that's where we see the nod to a kind of overt recognition of this phenomenon. Yeah.
remember in my study of the Strand magazine, there's actually kind of a tourist industry that grew up around the offices, where you could go and there's a gallery where you could watch the printing operations, and there's another room where you could go to see all the illustrations, on the wall, frames. Is there any sense on Wellington Street that there was a tourist crowd, or kind of there's a sense of spectacle that readers of these periodicals might come to look upon? I'm thinking of the bow window, sort of inviting kind of gaze.
Yeah, well, it really does, doesn't it? I mean, the interesting thing about the bow window is it reminds me when Dickens is exhibited in the window of the blacking factory, and he finds this intensely dreadful experience, and then he's almost sort of reproducing it by renting this building with its bow window. I mean, the area is mentioned very specifically in tourist guides. The only time it crops up in a sort of popular tourist guide is just mentioning it at Wellington Street as a thoroughfare from Covent Garden to the bridge as a kind of useful cut through. There's no mention that, oh, and by the way, all this great stuff being printed there. Of course, that changes after Dickens' death, and you get a slew of tourist guides saying, go there, the building is still there, you can see other locations. And in fact, the building that had Mayhew's office, I think, is still there. I think it was recently up for sale. And I'm convinced that is the original building. So certainly people in the later 19th century were doing exactly as you say, going and having a good old look, imagining it for themselves. Patrick?
Can you say a little bit about what you're working on now?
Yeah, so when I was working on this project, I found a lot of helpful discussion about what the streets might have looked like, the lots of debates about spectacle and display and visuality, but I wanted to get at a sense of the soundscape of the street and what it might have sounded like to Reynolds and to Mayhew. And there seemed to be less discussion about that. So what I'm interested in now is a study of the soundscape of early 19th century London before sound recording technology. So I'm interested in sound as found in print culture, in visual culture, and thinking about the intersection of the streets and popular culture. But it's very early days, so I shall let you know when I have more. I'm conscious that we're supposed to be moving in for dinner, so unless there's a final question, perhaps I'll hand over to Anne.
So, thank you very much.